Thank you very much for accepting this interview on the COMTOG project by ECPS. If you could just introduce yourself and what your role was in the development of the game Bury Me, My Love.
Okay, so my name is Florent Maurin. I'm from France. I'm a former journalist, and I funded the Pixel Hunt, the studio behind Bury Me, My Love. And on the project, I was co-writer of the story, game designer, and the producer, just to make sure that everything was going according to plan, basically.
How would you describe the game in your sort of own words? How would you sort of describe it to anybody that would ask about it?
So I would say that Bury My Love is a text message based interactive fiction documentary. Yeah, that's a little bit of a mouthful to describe it, but that's what it is, right? It's interactive, of course. It's a video game, but it's mainly based on exchanging text messages between two characters. And it's a fiction because the characters don't exist in real life, but it's also a documentary because it's been very much inspired by lots of different actual sources in real life.
Yeah, definitely. And that sort of authenticity does come across in the game, which sort of leads us into the next question. Video games typically in sort of the mainstream media or the way that it's understood in society have generally been sort of geared towards entertainment, but we have seen in recent years a sort of shift towards the sort of narrative storytelling aspects of video games. Mm-hmm. So what were your intentions, Pixel Hunt, but also you, behind sort of making Bury Me, My Love, keeping in mind the sort of gravity and severity of a topic like the refugee crisis?
You know, it's funny because if you look at video games history, among the very first video games, you find games that actually are kind of on the same path as we tried to do with Bury Me, My Love. For instance, one of the first video games is called Oregon Trail. And in that game, you have to live as a pioneer who tries to reach Oregon in the, I think it's the 19th or maybe 18th century. I'm not exactly sure when it's happening. But it's almost a documentary because you learn a lot of things about living in those conditions at that time. And then it was a little bit lost because of the economical crisis that almost killed video games in the mid-80s. They only survived because they focused on a younger audience and entertainment. So now it's complicated to come back to those roots and say, no, video games can be a lot more than just sheer entertainment. And I have nothing about video games as a form of brainless entertainment. Sometimes I play them that way too, and it's fine. I just think it's interesting to use this medium to its full potential and to its full extent. And typically for Bury Me, My Love, what we wanted to do is to try to give people to feel the actual situation and the actual things that you feel when you have the person you love on the other side on your phone, and all you can do is send them text messages and nothing else. So you feel helplessness and you feel love and you feel like you want to be there for them, but you can't really be there except for sending them supportive messages. And that's what we wanted to convey. And I think the interactivity that video games allow was one of the best ways, probably not the only way, but one of the best ways to convey that exact feeling that we wanted to convey.
Great. So yeah, you mentioned sort of the game mechanic behind Bury Me, My Love. And so I'd like to know a bit more sort of what came with the sort of creative decision-making process behind creating this main game mechanic, the sort of text thread on a mobile phone.
So creating Bury My Love gameplay-wise and mechanics-wise was actually very easy for us because we only had to look at what reality was like and just replicate that, mimic that in our game. Because actually the main influence behind Bury My Love was an article in French newspaper Le Monde. And the article was called "The Journey of a Syrian Migrant as Told Through WhatsApp Conversations." And this was actually just a series of text messages back and forth between a young woman called Dana and her family, part of her family being still in Syria and part of her family being already in Germany, as she was trying to attempt that very dangerous journey between Syria and Germany. And seeing all those text messages go back and forth and seeing how the people she loved try to help her and give her advice and assistance and look on the internet for info to just be able to push her forward. It was very clear to me that it was potentially a very interesting setting for a video game because of the interactive nature of sending messages back and forth, and B, it was basically what the game was going to be. It was going to be played in a mobile phone, on a mobile phone. It was going to look like a text messaging application. It was going to use some of the mobile phone features, such as notifications, so that it would mimic real life unfolding of events. So really, I'm sorry to say that, but we didn't have to exercise our imaginations and creativity a lot. What we had to do is understand what was very important to convey in the reality of the things happening and just translate that into video game language.
Well, definitely. Well, it definitely felt very real. In my own playthrough, you have it's sort of in the game mechanic. Just to explain briefly, the passage of time is both happening in real time when you're having the text conversation, but also when you're waiting for a response. And in my own playthrough, I often felt quite anxious as I saw the passage of time. I saw how much time was passing, and that was also its own anxiety. And that sort of element of time was very important during some of the tensest moments in the story. Why do you think it was important to include this sort of time dimension to the game?
Because, and that's something we figured out while making the game. It wasn't necessarily completely obvious to begin with, but the series of decisions that we made without exactly knowing why we made them, they made sense at some point. We realized that we decided for you not to be the actual person living the events, but her husband. So her husband, Majd, is Nour's husband, and he stayed in Syria because his mother and his grandfather still live there, and he has to take care of them, while she left because her sister just died and she just can't stay in Syria anymore. So they are split apart. And we decided that you as a player, you would not impersonate, because you will never impersonate someone in that situation if you're not in that situation yourself. But you would be some kind of a Jiminy Cricket on their shoulder, giving them advice on what advice they should give Nour, for instance. And we made this decision without exactly knowing why. It just felt better. And then we realized that's because we were not making a game about the actual experience of finding smugglers and being on boats and fearing for one's life, but we were making a game about the helplessness that the people who are in touch with the migrants who take those risks feel. And that was a slightly different view. And one, I think, was a good idea, because it would never have felt real to have someone write text messages while living something that's really hectic and dangerous, whereas answering someone else as best you can while facing the situation felt way more authentic and way more believable. So that's one of the reasons why we decided to put the player in that position. And hence, the use of those real-time mechanics, the use of notifications, the fact that you mainly wait, like 99% of your playthrough is spent doing nothing, but like taking your phone, putting it in your pocket and waiting to hear back from Nour and hoping that everything will be all right. All this is because actually the game is about the feeling of helplessness and unfair situation that those people have to face on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, definitely. I found it quite interesting. You mentioned sort of that. Was there a shift between, like, was that part of the decision making to choose between Nour or Majd for the player perspective?
Yes.
Okay.
when we bumped into this article with Dana talking with the family, we knew that it was the form that we wanted for the story to be told. We didn't want to have the player puppeteer a 3D avatar of a migrant, because that felt completely out of place. So we knew that the intimacy and the relative the lots of room that you leave for personal projection in text messages were definitely the right distance that we wanted to talk about this topic. But we still had to decide whether you would be on one side or the other. And I don't exactly recall when or how we made that decision, but I think it was pretty early on, because it felt way more, way closer to you as probably European or like American or a player, be in that position of the one who assists, the one who takes the risk, than to be in the position of the one who takes the actual risks and is maybe going to die. It felt closer, the gap to bridge between you as a human being and a person and a player, and the person you're supposed to be playing, impersonating, was probably way easier to gap with when you had to play as the person who assists the actual migrant.
That's very interesting, yeah. So one thing that the game balances quite well is sort of the gravity, the seriousness, and the fairly depressing nature of the situation, with levity, with humanity, and with humor, especially between the two characters, Nour and Majd. How did you find sort of balancing the game in terms of the writing in this sense, with the various paths and endings that the game has?
Well, it's really interesting, because once again, it comes from this article from Le Monde, and it comes from how Dana herself faced the situation. When you read the article, you see that the conversation is full of emojis. It's full of tiny moments of cute pictures that she sends her family to reassure them. It's full of questions such as, what is the result of Arsenal soccer team last night? Because I want to know, because she's with her brother-in-law and he's an Arsenal fan. So it's full of those little moments of life that you are bound to have when you're just having a chat with your relatives and loved ones. And it's only counterbalanced by the very vividly violent moments that she has to face. But it doesn't mean that she's only focused on the hard moments of life. Because Dana told us that she was actually hiding a lot of the worst things that were happening to her family, because she thought, what's the point of just telling them everything bad that happens to me, even though they can't do anything about it except just feeling bad for me. And B, because when you pick up your phone, you want to have emotional support. You want to have fun. You want to just have those moments that remind you that you're still a living human being, and with people who love you, and with people to survive for instance. And so that's how we approached the game writing. A, because we wanted to pay respect to how Dana faced the situation, and B, because we thought that it was actually the best way to remind people that, yes, those migrants are all human beings, as well as we are human beings, and they have relatives, and they have mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters and friends. And when they talk to them on their phones, you can feel that love, and we wanted players to be able to feel that love too.
Yeah, definitely. Speaking of sort of the player reaction, there are some comments that I've seen on the game's sort of Steam reviews, which should be taken with a grain of salt, but have sort of criticized the game's choices in depicting the refugee experience, citing that it appears too easy, or it seemed like an adventure, or it doesn't dive deep enough in representing the dangers and sort of the unwelcomeness of refugees. What reaction did you expect, and sort of what reaction did you have when you published the game, with those sort of comments in mind, I guess?
So we expected to be welcomed with a suppressing fire of xenophobia, and we were. We had lots of comments from people who said that we wanted to, I don't know, dissolve the white race into a tsunami of foreign people. So what that was expected, and that arrived. What was a little bit less expected was a negative reaction from people who are actually involved in France and other European countries in providing assistance to refugees and migrants. And some of them, not all of them, far from it, but some of them said that we were making money on the back of migrants, and we were trying to scam them and become rich thanks to them. It was a little bit expected, but not as vividly as some of the feedbacks we got. To those feedbacks, I can say, come and I will show you my bank account, and you'll see that it definitely didn't make us rich. But it's when people are locked into a way of thinking, it's really hard to challenge them, even presenting them with the way we worked, and the people we worked with who were directly concerned with the situation wasn't really going to convince them. And I completely agree. Some people, especially some people in the Syrian community, were really annoyed at the representation of refugees for two main reasons. The first one would be that effectively the situation that Nour faced is not the worst situation that a lot of other migrants faced, and more specifically the migrants who were obliged to stay in the neighboring countries such as Turkey and Jordan, because they didn't have any money. So they barely had enough to be just able to leave the country, and they settled in camps such as Zaatari or Idomeni, or no, not Idomeni in Greece, but the Turkish camps just at the border, and they live an absolute drama. But I would argue that we actually talk about them in the game, because Nour goes through those camps and she says the misery and the despair in which those people are. And another grief that we had is the character Nour, who is not as religious as a typical Syrian woman would be. She doesn't wear a hijab, she drinks alcohol. And those are, of course, things that are not compatible with like the majority of Syrian women, how they would typically behave, and what place the faith would take in their life, for instance. And I understand that that made some people angry, but we were inspired to make this game through Dana. And Dana was our main source. She was the person who trusted us with her life story. And Dana is that woman. She doesn't wear hijab, she drinks alcohol, she's fairly liberal in terms of like her place in the Syrian society. And she was also a little bit richer than the typical Syrian woman in the Syrian society, because she was able, for instance, to buy plane tickets from Syria to Turkey. So the first part of her journey was fairly easy compared to a lot of other people. And we did want also to pay respect to her trust and to the fact that she wanted to work with us, and so we couldn't go and see her and say, okay, you are this person, but we want to be representative of the majority of Syrian women, so we are going to change you into this other person who is completely not you. We couldn't do that. So yeah, it's kind of expected that some people were pretty mad about it, and especially on such sensitive topics as the place of women in the society and the place of religion in society in Syria. So it's completely expected that some people would be really mad, and I've seen very harsh comments. I understand them. I must also admit that we made a game that was doomed to being full of shortcomings in terms of representations, because you can't represent everybody in such a complicated situation. So we just had to live with it, and we knew that some of those comments were coming. So yeah, we're still living with it now.
All right. Yeah. Yeah. So you mentioned that you were your main source was Dana and her experiences, but the game Bury Me My Love has sort of 19 separate game endings. I myself only managed to get 2 different ones.
That's enough.
Yeah. Um, where did the inspiration come to have sort of different endings, multiple endings, and how did you try to represent the refugee experience through these separate endings?
So even though as a character, Nour is a direct inspiration from Dana as a person, and even though if you make a very specific series of choices, you can actually replicate Dana's journey in the game, we also wanted to show that there's way more than one path in that when you're in that situation. So we documented a lot. We read a lot of articles. We read a lot of we watched a lot of news reports and documentaries and testimonies, and we also interviewed ourselves, people in refugee camps in France, for instance. So we got a lot of testimonies and people telling us that they went through this path and through this and that, and just explained to us the diversity of the ways in which they tried to reach Europe, and sometimes succeeded and sometimes failed, and how they got stuck in Bulgaria, for instance, even though, of course, Bulgaria wasn't their first destination because they didn't know the language, they didn't know not anything about that country, but because of the Dublin Protocol, they had to sign for asylum in Bulgaria, so they had to be treated in Bulgaria, for instance. So all those informations that we gathered, and that so actually the first 4 months of production of the game were only dedicated to just documenting and reading and watching documentaries and exchanging between me and Pierre Corbinet, who is the main writer of the story, just to be sure that we knew what we wanted to tell. But at some point we had to stop, because the more you dig, the more you realize that some of the people have completely crazy path. We found testimony of 2 Syrian guys who flew through Brazil and then reached France. So, you know, you can't, once again, you can't account for every situation, but we wanted to account for as many different paths as possible, if only for players to get that there's a multitude of ways to try to reach Europe if you really think that your life depends on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, there's also something quite interesting with this game in that it has sadly still quite a sort of like modern relevance.
Yeah.
How do you sort of feel about that? The fact that the refugee experience that's depicted there, while not completely equivalent to the ones that exist today, with especially like refugees coming from Eritrea or from Ukraine, but sort of yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, when we were working on the game, we were both concerned that by the time we would be able to deliver the game, it would not be as relevant, and also pretty sure that it would be, sadly. And it proved us right, because we started working on the game in 2015, and the game was released in late 2017. And the question of forced migration from Syria because of the civil war was very much still in the news at the time. But you are completely right. Like the geographics, the specifics of the situation are about leaving Syria and trying to reach Europe. But it's completely still relevant for any other country, be them country in Africa or even countries in Europe, as we found out this year. Even though I think the experience of being a Ukrainian refugee, because of cultural reasons and because of pretty racist reasons, I would say, is probably fairly different from the experience of being from Eritrea, from Africa as a continent in general. Still, there are similarities, and still, it's still completely relevant today. And you know what? With the global warming situation, with the general geopolitical situation, I think it will sadly be still relevant for a long time. And maybe that's why people were moved by this game so much, because lots of people still talk to me about it, like know that it's been out for 5 years. I think that might be because they know that this is going to be Europe's future and concern. And I say concern not because it's a threat, but because it's something we are going to have to face in a way that is compatible with what are supposed to be our values as a union in the future, and we should be facing them that way now, and that's not always something that we do, as the news shows us every day.
Yes, definitely, yeah. Well, keeping sort of, yeah, that you mentioned that sort of the values that we're trying to replicate, but yeah, that comes with some difficulties. But you know, you've managed to portray something very interesting through the medium of video games. And as you mentioned, like, it's still touching people 5 years later. It certainly affected me when I played the game. So in sort of your view, what role can video games play in sort of boosting society's collective memory on events, or even sort of providing a more humane, more sort of humane perspective on some of these events?
Well, I can't talk for everybody because everybody comes with their own story and design games for their own reasons. But what I can say is that I come from a journalistic background, and what is very interesting to me is just to look at the world the way it is and to try to convey that to an audience, and that's what we were doing as when we were journalists. And that's exactly the same approach that we had when we started working on Bury My Love. Obviously, we have our own values, and obviously we wished Europe would be a more welcoming place, and at least with a clear politics, so that people can actually apply for asylum, and in following criteria that are actually reachable. In Great Britain, for instance, it's crazy because even the people in the government can't actually say how someone would be legitimately qualifying for a refugee status can actually apply without getting in the UK, whereas, as you know, it's completely impossible to get in the UK if you try to do that legally. But anyway, I digress. What I mean is, I think that lots of game designers have some kind of a god complex, and it's understandable because it's the very nature of games. You decide the rules. You decide what is right and what is wrong, and what you should do and what you should not do when you design a game. So that can give you the misleading feeling that you're the boss, and if you want to bend people's convictions in a certain way, you are going to be able to using video games. And I think it's wrong, because I think if you start with that in mind, you will end up with something that feels very forced and very manipulative, and people feel that like 10,000 kilometers away. What we try to do is we want to tell you a story, and actually a series of stories. You may like it, you may not like it, but those come directly from documentation, so they actually exist today. And what you do with your feelings afterwards, what you do with how it makes you feel, what you do with whether you connect with that person or not, is yours, is your responsibility as a citizen, as a human being, and as a person. It's not ours. We are not going to provide you with a moral to the story, for instance. We are just going to tell you this story. And then what you are going to do with it is up to you. And I think that's the reason why Bury My Love works as a work of art. And I say that with no particular pride. I just think that games are art, like any other form with authorship is art. I think why this works is because we didn't have a specific agenda. We didn't want to ask people to give to any NGOs, or we didn't want them to, I don't know, do anything. We just wanted them to be aware that the situation is that way for many people currently today, and that the countries they live in treat those people that way. And do they think it's fair? Do they think it's reasonable? Do they think it's aligned with what they think their values are? that's their responsibility. And that's really important, because I think that more often than not, we tend to associate video games with way more power than they actually have, and so misuse them and use them in ways that are just counterproductive, because it would actually push people away from what you try to convey. And that's not what we wanted to do. And so if I had one advice, it would be to try to approach that in a very humble way. Is just say, we have a story to tell, and we are going to tell it in the form of a video game because it fits the story we want to tell. But then you do what you have to do with it, and it's not our role to tell you what to think or what to do.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Yeah. Ultimately, yeah, one of the greatest assets of video games is its sort of interactivity, and that's something that other mediums don't really have. So
Yes.
I think that reflects your point quite well, that you sort of give players the tools, the story, but it's up to them to see how they play around with it, and what they get out of it.
It's always a little bit forced and limited, because you can only interact with the game insofar as the game designer intended you to interact with it. For instance, there's the clear decisions that Nour could have made that you can't make because we didn't write them, and we couldn't. We had to stop at some point. The game is 110,000 words long already, so it's been a nightmare enough as it is. But yes, this interactivity, the fact that the games work more as a discussion than as a discourse, a movie, an article, a radio broadcasts are discourses that you don't interact with, whereas games are discussions. You can ask the game questions. What happens if I do this and if I do that? And game answers you. And I think it involves player, I would not say more, but I would say in a different way. And in some specific situations, I think it can be useful if you want to convey a specific emotion or a specific mindset that is not the one that you know your player have in their everyday life.
Yeah, very super interesting discussion that we're having. Yeah, this sort of reaches the end. I think you mentioned the importance of discussion, and I think that's very important. I think that's what our project tries to do. Is we're trying to get these different voices, both from the side of game developers, but also scholars and also people that work on the ground, to try to, I mean, not discuss your video game specifically, but discuss the medium of video games, which I think more discussion is always good. Different voices. Yeah, I'm very excited. You mentioned you had another project in mind, or?
Yes, we have another game that's coming up in March next year, but it's got nothing to do with it's still what we call a reality-inspired games, because it still tackles topics that are very real and also very sad. But it doesn't have any relationship with the news or with any sociological question, or so it's a little bit more intimate and it's a little bit more philosophical maybe, but still very much related to the real life and our experience of it.
Great. Thank you so much, Florent.